Howdy folks, the Hearth Guy here, and do you remember what you had for breakfast today? I don't, because I didn't have breakfast, but that's neither here nor there. The human memory is a funny thing. We'll latch onto one thing and focus on it while ignoring everything else and making it drop completely from our memory. And with the audio-visual experience that is video games, it's easy to miss out on tiny aspects of either the story or the gameplay. However, sometimes it's not our own fault. Sometimes the game just does something and then moves on and your memory just doesn't even bother to process it, because it realizes what the game developers should have realized. Well, that was boring. Let's move on. This is most egregious when it happens to bosses. Bosses are meant to be challenges of skill, benchmarks of your progress that can either teach or reaffirm lessons that you can use later on. However, if the boss's existence is so inconsequential that you just don't remember it, then what is even the point of said boss? I've talked about some good bosses, but it wouldn't be a well-rounded discussion if I didn't talk about those that just got brushed under the rug. So come along with me as we count down the top 5 most forgettable bosses in video games. Destiny 2 has been going through something of a second renaissance recently. With the arrival of Lightfall and the seasons before it, it's risen up from its past when Destiny 2 was stagnating due to drip-feed content and the lack of a gripping story to keep its players coming back. Since then, Destiny 2 has really come into its own, developed into a pretty enjoyable experience that new players are getting into even now. That said, give any Destiny player this challenge to see how much they actually know about Destiny. See how many bosses in Destiny 2 that doesn't appear in a raid that they can actually name. Their answer will be telling. Somewhat of a bent rule since I'm using multiple bosses, but since this is so prevalent in Destiny 2, I feel it's fair to bring up. Destiny 2 has so many bosses, and the vast majority of them have little to no story, with mechanics that are by and large recycled from every other boss. I love me some Destiny, but you'd be hard-pressed to convince me that Skiffix Privateer is actually some deep and interesting character. I actually had to go and search for a boss that I had footage of because I couldn't remember any of the names of these minor bosses. While some can be made memorable with just small tweaks to the original formula, most get so formulaic that they just blend together until you can't even remember which bosses go where. Heck, some of them are just blatant copies of previous bosses. Whether it's Ear Gaza, the Aspect of Crota, or Glugor the Whispering One, they all just slip through the cracks. In fact, Glugor the Whispering One isn't even real. I just made him up, but I bet you couldn't tell the difference. Now, mind you, not all bosses need to be super memorable showstoppers, especially in a game as big as Destiny 2. With so much going on and so many missions and activities, it would take a lot of work to make every single one of them into something to keep track of. But this list is about forgettable bosses regardless, so I gotta count them. Except Glugor. Glugor's cool. Man, don't you just love the classics? I've been trying to dig in some of these older titles recently and see what made them so great. There must have been a reason for them to have stood the test of time, right? Well, among these are the original Mega Man games, which actually hold up fairly well. The original bosses and levels have an air of authenticity to them, making them feel like someone actually sat down and thought hard about them. This comes through with the Robot Masters most of all, primary content of any Mega Man game. A rogue's gallery of enemies for Mega Man to beat and then steal their powers. Does that mean they're all perfect? No, but they have heart behind them. Unfortunately, you can probably tell that they're not all created equally. At least one of them has to live in the shadows while the rest shine bright like a diamond. For that, we'll have to take a look at the original game. The growing pains of early Mega Man affect every boss in the very first installment. But when you don't even get a spiritual successor like the other Robot Masters, you know you've done something wrong. And none of that can be truer than Gutsman. Of the original Robot Masters, Gutsman really sticks out like a sore thumb. Here we have basic elemental and weapon-based bosses like water, fire, wind, and scissors. Meanwhile, we have stronger than average man who throws rocks at us like a chimpanzee. Gutsman's attacks are comedically simple. He stops all movement when he jumps and lands on the ground, and he throws a large shattering block at you, which is pretty easy to dodge at a moderate distance. While there can be some RNG involved if he decides to charge you, which can make the boulders harder to dodge, the rest of it is just stand in one spot, jump, shoot, and repeat until he dies. His level, with its notoriously hard to time dropping platforms and deceptive drop points, will probably kill you more than he will. and some annoying enemy placement will likely take out plenty of your health and therefore lead you to being beaten at least once. But go in with a full HP bar and you can easily rinse him. Despite its age, Mega Man 1's bosses are still relatively complex for the most part, but Gutsman has exceptionally little going on. Like I said, whereas most of the Robot Masters had their skills passed on to future bosses, Gutsman's moves were left in the past where they belong. Still better than Bondman, who was literally a glue robot. In another world, I suppose. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is a fun game, but in between bad stealth and a purposely nonsensical plot, it has some of the best bosses I've ever seen in a video game. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call Rising a glorified boss rush, and even the longer levels are worth replaying just to experience the heights that this game has to offer. And then there's level 3. The third level of Metal Gear Rising is one of the slowest, most irritating parts of the game, with Raiden using the poor stealth mechanics to not sneak past a pack of gorillas waiting to curb stomp you back to Donkey Kong country. And while I could go on for a while about how bad the level is, that's not the point. The point is what lies at the end of it, the supposed final boss of the level, the Grad. At the end of every mission is some big confrontation with the core members of Desperado, the private military that is the central antagonistic faction of the story. However, not so at level 3. Instead, you have to fight the Grad, a glorified forklift. Not only does it have a generally unremarkable design, but it just sort of appears and disappears without any fanfare. I mean, it's used as a common enemy in the very next level, and unlike the Dark Souls style where it's usually pretty cool to see, this is just so jarring that you have to go, wait, wasn't I just fighting you? And it doesn't help that as soon as it's destroyed, the game moves on like nothing happened. The characters don't even refer to it existing, and then 2 minutes later the mission ends and it's a common enemy now. It's honestly kind of funny how little the game seems to care about it, almost encouraging you to ignore the fact that this fight ever happened. And you know what? It worked. On the bright side, you'll get plenty of practice fighting its clones from here on out. Isn't that fun? Elden Ring has a lot of forgettable bosses, due in no small part to its propensity to reuse assets as both bosses and overworld enemies throughout the lands between. However, you'll at least think when you run up on a duplicate, hey, I know you, due to having seen it so many times. With that in mind, I chose to look a bit further back in order to find a boss that time and I had both forgotten about. Back to Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 has twice the number of bosses compared to the original Dark Souls, so it's unsurprising that some will slip through the cracks. That said, there's something truly special about this next boss. Said boss is so boring that they needed to put it in the middle of one of the most terrifying areas in the game just to be remembered. And it failed. The Prowling Magus and Congregation is a very strange boss fight to begin with. As the gatekeepers of the absolute spider-infested nightmare that is Seldora, you'd expect something of a bit more relevance to either the area or the lore. Instead, we get a random mage that exclusively uses dark spells, 2 clerics that can heal him, and a crowd of scrambling grunts that all share a health bar with the priests. The only true difficulty lies in the possibility of getting ganged up on, but with alluring skulls you can easily divert the attention of the congregation away from the squishier magus and the clerics. The clerics, at least for me, are the most annoying, but only superficially. Their lightning spells can do a lot of damage, especially when boosted by a bonfire ascetic, but even then they're only dangerous because of the mosh pit surrounding them, some of which won't always work right and make the fight even simpler. Dark Souls 2 really is the black sheep of the original Dark Souls trilogy, and while I don't hate it as much as others do, Prowling Magus and Congregation aren't exactly Ornstein and Smo over here. The Magus can actually be somewhat difficult, since there can be some surprises to its attack patterns. Despite being a mage, it will actually run at you in order to do a strong shockwave attack that'll take a pretty big chunk out of your health. But once it's on its own, the Magus is absurdly simple without the crowd or the clerics to back it up. Because of all this, and the aforementioned spider-infested nightmare ahead, is it any wonder how anyone could just forget that these guys are technically part of the Dark Souls roster of bosses? I sure can't. I didn't even remember they existed when I first thought of this video. Really goes to show ya, huh? Tibia Mariners, Elden Ring. With so many of these guys dotting the map and being a general nuisance to hunt down for their death route, the irritation of them actually makes them more memorable, hence why they're here. Gru's Mother, Hollow Knight. It's a giant fly that attacks by yeeting itself. Whenever you talk about early bosses, the most memorable part about this is the fact that its children explode from it. I've brought attention to a lot of bosses so far that even the games they belong to seem content to leave ignored. But none so more than our number one. A boss so forgettable that the game doesn't even acknowledge its existence before or after. So negligible that despite showing up in a cutscene, the characters barely even register that they're fighting it. One simply vanishes without mention in the most hilarious way possible, in no small part due to the fact that it's a dragon. Yeah, a dragon. What are supposed to be these mythical beasts of legend and power is completely hand-waved and swept away, despite the fact that it's a mandatory boss fight. Ladies, gents, and all others, allow me to introduce to you, from Xenoblade Chronicles 3, Umber Drag. Xenoblade has always had a funny relationship with dragons in its games. They tend to just come out of nowhere and then die without much reference, but none get that treatment harder than Umber Drag. Not only is it one of the only dragon bosses in the game, it is a mandatory one, not long after the David and Goliath fight against Colony Lambda and the climactic confrontation with Consul J. And yet, here it is, just standing there menacingly. It's almost humorous how it's positioned. You turn around the corner and boom! I can't even with this guy. Umber Drag isn't even all that interesting a boss mechanically. Compared to other dragon bosses in the series, it is painfully easy. Don't get me wrong, on hard mode it can still take your party members down, and it can resist plenty of your debuffs and attacks, but most of the time, it's just standing there. It becomes more active in its second phase, but that's not really saying much, besides flapping its wings and stepping on you, I guess. Elden Ring may reuse dragons excessively, but at least they do cool dragon things most of the time. This one just tries to mildly nudge you with his foot. Really putting up a fight there, ain't you, pal? And once it's all over, he gets punched in the face, killed, and disappears. No explanation, no follow-up. A literal dragon was here, was killed, barely put up a fight, and we all collectively agreed to move on. Okay then. Above all, what I feel makes Umber Drag worthy of this spot is the dissonance of the entire affair. Fighting giant monsters is usually really cool and something that Xenoblade does often and gets right. However, most of the time those fights are optional. Optional bosses have much less requirements to be memorable or even necessary, but it is impossible to move through the story without beating the Umber Drag. And in a game where you fight giant mechas, lightning summoning monsters, and more, the lack of reference and complete dismissal of this technical main story boss is somewhat laughable. Couldn't it have at least looked less like a T-Rex with wings, please?
Would you just die already?
As always, I am the Hearth Guy. Remember to like and subscribe if you want to stay up to date on my latest videos and if you want to support the channel. Feel free to leave a comment down below telling me your thoughts on some of the most forgettable boss experiences you've had in video games, and I will see you all next time around the hearth.